Good evening now, everyone. I'm tracking last panel, so I know I'm the only thing standing between us and the soiree, and we all win drinks. So for the final panel today, we've got Continuum of Service, the veteran story through the media lens. I'm the moderator. I'm Rob Moser, 19 years in the infantry, gunnery sergeant, now working congressional stuff at the Pentagon. We've got Dr. Scott Parrott and Dr. David Albright, as well as Miss Patricia Kime. I've got their bios, but I think I'd rather just let them talk about their background and how they got into the world that they work in. So, Ms. Kime, since you're sitting here, and ladies first.
Oh, well, thank you. So I have been covering the veterans and military space for more decades than I'd prefer, starting out at the Jacksonville Daily News. My husband is a retired Marine now, and I started in the intelligence community in Washington, D.C., and moved to Jacksonville, where I couldn't get a job. So the newspaper gave me a job. And I will say that through the years, it's been a really interesting evolution to watch just the coverage, media coverage of active duty military all the way through veterans, and the growing interest, probably starting in around 2009, 2010, as more Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans or personnel became veterans, and watching that evolution has been really interesting. So that's my backstory. And right now I cover military and veterans personnel and medical issues mainly for military.com.
Go with Dr. Parrott next.
Hey, so I'm Scott Parrott. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Journalism and Creative Media at the University of Alabama. My background before academia was in journalism, so I worked for newspapers as a reporter and an editor in Alabama and the state of North Carolina. And then I returned to school and began studying media representations of social groups and the effects that those representations have on people's thoughts, behaviors, and emotions toward those groups. And so now, as the name plate there indicates, I'm the director of the Veterans and Media Lab at the university.
Dr. Albright.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here today. My name's David. I am an Army veteran. Currently, I am a distinguished research professor and an endowed chair in mental health research. Most of my work has been around veteran behavioral health. So think about mental health related challenges, substance use, substance misuse, and other related outcomes. And I look forward to the discussion today.
All right, thank you. So the general idea for our panel is, after 20 years of war, the growth of new media and the continued use of traditional media, also combined with the smaller number of people who actually have direct ties to the military, those media sources generally are the way that most veterans are able to tell their stories. So to kick it off right up front with that, the smaller portions of the population having a direct connection to veterans and service members since the start of the all-volunteer force, what are your opinions on the pros and cons of the way that media is portraying us? Ms. Kime.
Well, it's an excellent question. I come from a military family, and I'm always interested in the fact that there are people in the world that don't know anybody in the military. And in DC, that circle is, also, it's a small circle. People know people in the military. So I think there's a huge responsibility by the media to portray veterans in all lights. Unfortunately, with the rapid, emphasis on breaking news, the unfortunate incidents tend to get covered much more quickly than the very good things that veterans do in this space. And there's also a tendency, I believe, to sort of just not have the time to deeply go into coverage. So I think the advantage has been that there's been a larger, somebody mentioned the war horse earlier. I know that Dan Lamoth was here, and there are many outlets right now to get those voices heard. And I do feel like there are the outlets to have those stories told. But the veterans need to get into those spaces and make sure and just persist in trying to get their stories told.
We'll go with Dr. Parrott next.
Sure. So Dr. Albright and I have been working together for several years now with this Veterans and Media Lab, where we've been conducting studies that look at how the mass media actually represent military veterans, and then what kind of effect that actually has on both members of the general public, but then also people who have served. And so some of the studies that we've done have looked at news representations. And so, for example, we did one study where we looked at the major metro papers in all 50 states and looked to see, I guess, what kind of commonalities we saw across the stories, what kind of themes we could identify. And so we looked at, over 1,000 social media posts from these news organizations. And the really interesting thing was, even though we had 50 news organizations and over 1,000 stories, the themes were limited to essentially 3. And so those themes are probably very familiar to you all. One is the theme of the wounded warrior, I guess someone who is suffered because of their service. Another one that's related to that is the victim. And these are news stories in which veterans are associated with victimization from bureaucracy or crime or something like that upon returning home. And then the other one is actually what could be considered a positive stereotype, and that's the hero theme that we saw, where all veterans are heroes. And so since we did that initial study, we've been doing a number of other studies where we're looking at other forms of media content. We're finding very similar messages, and we're also looking at how it affects people. And so we've found some ways in which it can affect everything from civilians' desire to be socially close to veterans to policy-related decisions as well.
Dr. Albright.
Yeah, I think my reflection is more along the lines of, thinking about the origination of the word media, which comes from a Latin word meaning middle. And I think traditionally media has referred to professional journalists and news organizations that many of us who are maybe in my age cohort and older, so 40s, 50s, and olders, might readily identify, on like a TV screen. And I think with the emergence of social media, the voices in the middle have multiplied and diversified. And all of this is to say it's likely pretty challenging for consumers of media, including veteran media consumers, to make sense of the messaging that's being provided to them, to know, what is accurate, what's fair, what can be trusted. I think that some of the work that Dr. Parrott is leading, and that I'm fortunate to be able to contribute to, I think what we're trying to get at in part is like asking or challenging you all to think about who benefits by the messaging of the media that we're taking in. I think we're coming at it critically. And I think that one place it might lead us, and opportunities for those of you in the audience, would be what might you be able to do to foster, to build, to improve your media literacy skills. And I think the work that the lab is doing is contributing to that conversation. So I think when we're thinking about the portrayal of veterans I think it's increasingly challenging for all of us, and I think that it's incumbent on all of us to improve our skill set in how we identify that messaging and how we manage it.
So you mentioned media literacy, and then Dr. Parrott, you mentioned the stereotypes of the broken warrior and the victim. I'm a multiple tour combat veteran. I dealt with my issues. I got through. I feel like I got stronger. So taking those two things, and it's just kind of near and dear to my heart. Could y'all give some ideas on how veterans can increase their media literacy skills to help communicate that we're not broken, that our experiences can be tragic or painful, but they can also, inspire growth. So we'll go in reverse this time. So Dr. Albright, if you want to kick it off.
I'm sitting with your question for a minute. I think one opportunity would be in our post-secondary settings, which is, in our colleges and universities, and thinking about how we can introduce into existing curricula and courses. I think approaches to being able to make sense of the messaging that we receive. So more concretely, in a classroom setting, I wouldn't want to take for granted that my students are even interacting with the media in a critical way, and I would challenge them to question, again, who benefits from this message. I think as a father to four daughters who engage with small screens a fair amount, I take time to be with them and to be present and to try to get into their headspaces as they're engaging with messaging, and to try to provide my narrative with them to help them understand that the messaging is not necessarily good or bad, but that they need to not take it for granted. And I think perhaps by extension, I think one way to improve media literacy would be to work with people who can help you to question and to be critical of the content that we're receiving, to be skeptical and perhaps not cynical, but to really question what we're receiving, and not really to sit on our hands. And just because a message might have been framed in one way in 2021, that same messaging in 2022, perhaps, hopefully post-pandemic, might have a very different effect. And I think we have to continually critically reevaluate.
I'll just echo that. I think that there's three different approaches that research and psychology suggest can improve, I guess, attitudes between groups when there's a bit of a misunderstanding as to the group members. And so one of those is simply contact. And so, for example, I can tell that many of the media messages I personally encounter are way too narrow and lacking depth. Because I personally have friends and family members who have served. And so that provides a little bit more nuance. And so I guess one recommendation I would make is, if you're trying to change like the news narratives and you are a veteran, a simple way to do it is to actually connect with community journalists. And so I think a lot of us tend to think really broadly toward the national scale. And so when we think about journalists, we think about, Fox News and CNN and the New York Times and Washington Post, and these publications that are primarily centered around national audiences, and where journalists might be a little bit less accessible. And so if you are a veteran and you'd like to kind of change the narratives, or I guess nurture greater dialogue in your local community, I would just encourage you to connect with community journalists at your local newspaper, your local television station. Because one of the things that we found through our research is that military veterans are very popular. It's a very popular social group, and by extension of that, veterans can be very influential. And so I think you can use that to your advantage, to connect with journalists and educate journalists, which is another approach. Educate journalists about the messages and inaccuracies or oversimplifications that are out there in the news. And I think the more journalists you connect with, the more willing they will be to, or the greater understanding they will have. Because I don't think, I always hesitate to discuss groups as a whole, because there's always, I guess, the danger of stereotyping. But I think just based on my personal and professional experience and the journalists that I've worked with across the country and around the world, really, I think that there are not often ill motives there. And so when journalists are actually covering stories, one of the motivating forces is to get at the truth. And so if journalists are providing these very shallow representations of what it means to serve, and that's not accurate, if you point that out to them, if you protest it, if you educate them, I think they would be readily willing to listen and to potentially change the narrative. And so the next question would be, what other stories can you actually tell? And so that's one of the questions that we've been trying to think through, and trying to figure out a way to connect journalists with. And so I'll leave it there.
So we've noticed, on our platform, most people get their news by going to their Facebook or going to their Twitter. They're not going to the homepage of the Washington Post. They'll see a story about the Washington Post from Dan Lamothe, who I guess was here earlier, and they'll comment, or they'll share it on social media. And I guess one of the ways to really think critically about what is going on is, instead of just blindly reacting to stories on social media, is maybe being that person to ask some questions, in the comment section, instead of just reacting. Just say, what is the source on this, and is this a reliable source, and what is the writer's point of view? Does the writer have a point of view? Ask those questions that literally a college professor would ask, and get maybe try to get a conversation started. You're probably going to get hammered because everybody's nasty on social media, but I mean, it's worth trying to try that. I was talking with a veteran who studies extremism, and he said, one of the things I didn't really, early on, I blindly thought I was a constitutionalist, and I realized that I had never actually read the Constitution. And it wasn't until I went to college that I learned to challenge the thought behind what I was seeing on YouTube and what I was told directly. So, I think if we even, not everybody can go to Columbia to learn that, but if we could just go on social media and people could say, well, why do you think that way? Or let's dissect the story. And it might be interesting to just try to get people to think critically.
So going with, I picked up a couple things between all three of you, talking about what one thing in 2020 could be taken different in 21 or in 22. Dr. Parrott, you talked about reconnecting and communicating and broadening that view and getting the nuance introduced back in. And Ms. Kime, you brought up social media, stuff like that. Earlier in the program, we had Secretary Hagel talk to us, and he mentioned Rand's Truth Decay. And one of in their Truth Decay project, they talk about the echo chamber of social media. But also, as time's gone on, we've seen more polarization, more extreme polarization. So kind of a multi-part question here. How do you feel that polarization, especially since you're getting so much of the same viewpoint, how do you think that polarization is affecting veterans as veterans? And then for that reconnect and build a nuance and help improve, tell our story, how much do you think that polarization is affecting that goal? And how can we work to get better at it? No, Ms. Kime. Sorry.
I want somebody else to go first on this question.
Okay.
This is a hard question. I've been really dismayed by the polarization and the lack of just the lack of thought, the just assumptions. There's a lot of assumptions going on. Like they're just, you're the left-wing media or you're the right-wing media, and people who don't know, the reporters make a lot of just accusations, and they don't actually read the stories. That's another. I mean, I think this is a main thing. Like people see headlines and they just spew. So I don't know how we educate people to actually read the articles that they're commenting on, and just actually like think about, try to get outside the box. Yes, probably the media is contributing to this polarization, and I wish I had the answers to how we fix that, and I don't.
Dr. Parrott.
So I was actually having a conversation with a colleague the other day that I thought was interesting. But we were talking about the echo chamber that you mentioned, and her argument was that the echo chamber doesn't even matter because the people who are all of us, when we use social media, when we use any kind of media, we're motivated and we're active, and so we're making decisions. And so a lot of us prefer that echo chamber. And so even when we are exposed to, I guess, information that contradicts our beliefs or our thoughts or our emotions. So when we're essentially exposed to information that's not within the echo chamber, we sort of, we bristle, and we're oftentimes not as willing to listen. And so I think a lot of it has to do with that second part that y'all were discussing with polarization and the need to essentially not be so polarized and not jump to conclusions and not let our interactions be driven by emotion, but to do what y'all were talking about earlier, where question, as Dr. Albright said, question people's motivations, question your own feelings when you encounter news articles, and ask yourself, am I having a reaction because I'm really invested in this issue? And if so, what kind of positive outcome could I have rather than screaming at someone on social media? So you had asked, I think you'd asked about the effects on veterans as well. And I guess what exposure these types of messages might have on veterans themselves. And so that's one of the things that our lab has been looking at as well. And another colleague and friend in this field of veteran studies introduced me to this notion of the looking glass self, and how our perceptions of ourselves as human beings are often reflected by what we think others are thinking of us, right? And so one of the questions that we're sort of dealing with right now is how veterans internalize what other people think about them. Like, if I was to ask you as a veteran, what do you think others are thinking about you based on what you see in the media, and what kind of effect that has on you? I think it's a really interesting and important question. We don't have the answers to it yet, but it's something that we're investigating, and that we think is important because, if you have assumptions about what others are thinking about you, it can change everything the way you think about yourself and your community, your groups to which you belong. It can change your behavior, the way you act around others. And so, to give like a real world concrete example, just building off of that, the whole PTSD association and the negative stereotype, I guess you could say, of a military veteran having PTSD and having an increased likelihood of being violent toward others, which is false. But if I assume that others are thinking that about me because I'm a veteran, how does it affect my behavior? And I've spoken to veterans, and this is just anecdotal, but I've spoken to veterans who are not willing to say that they're actually that they actually served, because they don't want other people to think that, and they don't want the questions that are sort of ignorant questions, such as how many people have you killed a person, how many people have you killed, and things like that. And so I think really connecting with the community is incredibly important, and ensuring that people do get that contact that's outside of the media realm. And then also trying to change the narrative that is within the media. And so you had speakers earlier who are working to get veterans in newsrooms, so that you can have someone creating stories who has actually served. I think that's a great step. But then also connecting with your community journalists, your storytellers, and connecting with neighbors and other people in your community. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
I think what I would add to my colleagues is that I also have concerns of how the veteran herself or himself might be affected, but perhaps by the way that extremist thinking might be decentering other things. So for instance, I think research shows that military is one of the, if not the most trusted occupation. So does this period of time where we are seeing, which is to say, there's more visibility around extremist thinking, is that decentering that trust? By presenting such an extreme, it's like tossing a lasso around it and kind of pulling it towards the extreme position in one way. What effects, if any, will extremism have on, the larger public's trust of the occupation? And military is really an institution. So I think perhaps by extension, are we talking about decentering or destabilization of institutions with some of the extremist thinking? And so, I think our institutions are part of, if you will, the social environment in which veterans and their families and organizations that support them all kind of work within. So I start thinking then, if we have decentering, destabilization of that social environment, if you're following me, what type of effects does that have on the media, on the veteran? And I don't think I have an answer for that, but I good or bad, I mean, I think we're going to get to that. And I just don't know what to expect. And I think it's also made or exacerbated by what I think most of us know, which is with the decreasing number of individuals who have military experience, we also are going to have a decreasing number of individuals, for instance, elected officials who have military experience, or at least the likelihood of that going down. And so I think we're going to start seeing increasingly leadership, people in positions of power and authority who don't necessarily have what I would hope to be a very grounded perspective of the complexity of being a veteran. I don't think it has to be intellectual and cerebral like I am, mind you, but like who have lived it, and who can contextualize the process of decision making with lived experiences. And I think that's going away. So I think extremism plays into that as well, within kind of the larger social environment and potential decentering or destabilization that I think that we're seeing. So I'll leave it at that.
Dr. Parrott, when Dr. Albright started talking, I saw you perk up and kind of bounce around and smile and keep nodding. So you look like you might have something to say on the topic. I'm kind of interested if you want to expand on that.
Oh no, I just thought he was making some really interesting points about, I guess, the lack of trust in institutions and how this extremist sort of language and approach to life that you're seeing on social media primarily and through politics. I guess the kind of the big picture implications that it can have. That's one of the reasons I love working with Dr. Albright. I was just enjoying what he was saying.
All right. So going with extreme, the polarization, extreme thought, destabilization, how and the loss of trust in institutions that are traditionally the social glue that society uses to stay together. How can veterans, through media interactions, help try to repair that damage, to rebuild the trust in those institutions? Is there a way y'all think that we can do that?
Well, I'll throw in here. Oh, go ahead.
Whoever wants to go first. We'll go with Dr. Parrott.
So actually, David, I'll turn it to you if you don't mind.
Well, what I was going to start us off with was maybe challenging all of us who have military service to own our experiences and our messaging. And I think what I'm calling criticality maybe comes into place here. So when you encounter a message that's false, correct it. You know, I think for many of us, one of the things that the military experience really forces us to be able to use our voices and to take stands of various sorts. And so I would say apply that in the civilian setting. Use your voice, take the risk to not agree and to correct something that's not true. I also think there's something there about modeling. And I think what I mean by this, in part, is that just because the messaging portrays veterans in certain ways doesn't mean you need to act that or somehow fall in step with what maybe the expectations that are being crafted by media seem to be for you and others, just because, again, it's comfortable. So I think the message I'm trying to say here is like resist and use your voice and take a stand. And I think be the leader that you have some level of training to be, certainly around the messaging and your identity.
Now we'll go with Dr. Parrott.
Okay, great. I would actually build off of what David was just saying in terms of protesting, challenging, but I would encourage veterans to keep in mind. I guess the best approach is for communication and for doing that. And I think that personal narratives can be incredibly powerful. And so if you just picture like a social media, like let's say we have a news story, and then you look at posts beneath that news story, and you notice as a veteran that the news story is doing a poor job, I guess, representing veterans, or you think it's not accurate, or it's not providing enough depth, so on and so forth. There's a number of ways you can challenge that, right? I mean, you could write the journalist himself or herself. You could post a comment yourself, but then the next question is, what kind of comment do you post? And so you can, yell and scream and say this is wrong, this is downright wrong, and how dare you? Or I think a more proactive approach would be to share your own personal story if you're willing. And granted, you're limited in the amount of space you have, but you could focus in on challenging the assumptions that you would like to correct. And I think that can be really powerful. We haven't done this in terms of veterans, but I've conducted research related to mental health and sort of the same thing, like media representations of mental health and mental illness. And we've actually looked at comments like that. And we found that those types of comments actually do elicit a more positive reaction, and they can be more persuasive. And so I would say that personal narratives can be incredibly powerful in shaping other people's perceptions and understanding of the diversity of the veteran experience. And, you know, the narratives that we mentioned earlier about the sort of wounded warrior and the hero and the victim, you know, there's accuracy there, but it's just lacking nuance. It's lacking depth. It's I don't know. It's just really honing in on it's not providing a big enough narrative. And so I guess expand the narrative would be my recommendation. Expand it with your elected leaders, expand it with your local journalist, expand it with, you know, anyone you feel.
I would say that I would love to see veterans who are in, you know, whatever job you're in, I'd love to see them just be like, I'm a veteran, and like not, you know, maybe they don't have to tell their whole story, but the more we see veterans in places where people don't expect veterans, you know, and I think of the Representative Kinzingers in the world and Representative Mast, and there's like just so many veterans that are just doing great jobs and great things. Kayla Williams was just here. You know, if somebody doesn't know her, you know, they'll be like, oh, you work at VA, but she, you know, she needs to stand up and say, yeah, well, yeah, I'm also a veteran, you know. So the more that every veteran says I'm a veteran, and the more America, you know, sees that veterans are out there being so much a part of America right now, that doesn't have to do with extremism or doesn't have to do with I think I saw that, you know, 25% of Americans like think that every vet has PTSD. It's probably higher than that. I think the more America knows, then, you know, this narrative would hopefully shift. I mean, every time I meet a veteran, of course, I want to know their story. But I would love to see most of America wanting to hear those stories too.
So, in conjunction with what we started all this with the growing the civ-mil divide and the lack of communication and experience and connection, add in new media sources that tend to be echo chambers and are, you know, they're going for clicks, and more traditional news cable news networks in the 24-hour news cycle just going for ratings. Bad news sells. So while it's certainly true, extremism, you know, sexual assault, all these things happen in the military, and they're all wrong and terrible. They're also a minority, but that seems like it's becoming a growing majority of the stories. Are there any suggestions y'all would have to help veterans get the message out? We accept these things are there, they're wrong, they need to go away, but the majority, again, turn that narrative positive. The majority of the people are not like that. This is what we're really like. Any suggestions, ways to do that, or good best practices? Ms. Kime, you perked up a little bit.
Well, I mean, the media could contribute by, you know, constantly not like going for clicks. And this world that's just how it is right now, and it's not good. I believe that veterans, again, use social media platforms to push back. If they get out there in their neighborhoods and show them that they're productive members of society and they're not these people. And the more you can get out there and have your face seen and be a part of the community, and take on leadership positions. And I mean, so many things that you learn in the military are so valuable to all of America. And I think just by, you know, following that path of being a good citizen. We can try to overturn that, but I'd love to think that we would stop reporting on, the Vanessa Guillens of the world, but it would help if those incidents, are stopped. So, there's got to be top-down leadership within the military, and that, once that happens, and not everything's ever going to be perfect, but if we could make a concerted effort to change, that would help.
Go with Dr. Albright.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what I heard to be a point around getting out and doing, be visible, afford other people opportunities to get to know you as a representative of, let's call it the veteran tribe. I think, though, I would also challenge all of us to perhaps not over-identify with the veteran tribe, and if you will, to identify more, quote, with the civilian tribe, whatever that is. And I appreciate there's a lot of diversity in that, and so maybe if I had a picture, what I might do is draw a big circle in a little circle, and the big circle might be veteran, little circle civilian. And I sometimes think that veterans oftentimes are kind of like that. They largely identify in relation to their military experiences, and perhaps the size of the circles change as an individual has more time between service. I don't think we know this definitively, mind you. And I think, to stick with that visual, I think what I would challenge vets is to maybe have that big circle be more civilian and a little circle be veteran, and to try to anchor, root yourself in other communities and be proud of your military service for sure. But allow yourself to identify with additional groups. I think that might go a ways also with perhaps some of the extremist activities that seem to be occurring on certain platforms. So, to kind of summarize what I'm processing here, might be an intentionality and not over-identifying with your military experience. And again, I want to belabor even the point. It's not to say not to be proud of your experiences in uniform, but appreciate that you're not in uniform now, and kind of bring those experiences to the much larger, broader civilian context, if you will, and look for ways to identify with additional groups within that broader or bigger circle, if you will, allowing the veteran piece to always be there, but perhaps not to be the dominant identity. But I think that there'd probably be disagreement with this, and I can't think offhand of research certainly around the perhaps changing nature or effect of military service on like decision making, for instance, as an individual becomes like more distal or distant from their time of service. But I'll be quiet for a minute.
So you had mentioned clicks and the goal of journalists and news publishers to get clicks and to get eyes on their stories so that they can generate advertising revenue. That is a very, that's the reality that we're living in now. That's how news organizations actually survive is through clicks. That's how reporters are paid. But there's a value system in journalism. We are trained to separate income from the stories we tell. And so there's traditionally been a separation between the advertising side of a newsroom, the financial side of a newsroom, and the journalists who are actually covering the stories. And so oftentimes journalists are not driven and motivated by advertising and things like that. They do, granted, work within a system that is driven that way, and they might experience pressure to generate clicks. I know they do. But at the same time, you have other values that are sort of conflicting with that. And so I guess that's a long way of coming about to my point, where I think that understanding the system and understanding how journalists work can be very helpful for veterans who are trying to change the narrative. And so when you start to think about like the different values that drive journalism and the values that we actually teach students in journalism school, the things that make a news story, the things that make something willing or something desirable to cover, I guess, are values such as an event that's unexpected, an event that happens that has proximity, that is close to your community, an event that's timely, so something that happened recently, and as you mentioned earlier, conflict. And so journalists do cover conflict. And so I think, you know, when journalists are covering these stories, maybe like the performance of the VA hospitals or something in the local community, oftentimes it's driven by conflict. And studies show that stories go viral, news stories go viral when they elicit emotion, and conflict is one of those, anger is one of those. And so if journalists are focusing on stories that generate some anger, the stories are more likely to spread and to be shared. And so my point would be, the polar opposite of that is that on the other end of the spectrum, stories that are inspirational and stories that are surprising are also more likely to be shared. And so I would just say, if I was a veteran living in a community trying to change the narrative, and I came across something that involved veterans that was, you know, inspirational or surprising, it could be even my own story. If you share that, there's a strong likelihood that it will grow. That story will sort of be a seed that grows a bit and reaches potentially a broader community. And so that's one sort of practical way I think you might be able to go about it.
So I kind of a comment before we go, I open it up for questions, but gentlemen, from both what you said, Dr. Albright, when you talked about the little circle, big circle, that's just a personal observation. I've always felt that there are some veterans who swap their circles, and then, you know, to tie into the positive, let's reinforce that small circle should become a part of the rest of your big circle. And instead of painting the narrative of the wounded warrior or the broken person and all that, or that's all you are, use that as an example of how that's the best of what you could be and make everyone around you better, kind of. So it's kind of a personal view I've always had. So y'all two bring it up and kind of tying it together. I appreciate that. So I'm going to go ahead and open it up for a question.
In reference to sparking the emotions, in reference to the clicks and those type of things. So I love the idea of focusing on inspiration and surprise versus anger. So in reference to that, is there in the journalism world more focus on anger? It seems like it. It appears to be. And why? Because if the focus is on emotion, anger is not the only emotion, which was, you know, brought up about, you know, being surprised, being inspired. And being surprised, being inspired is better than the whole anger thing. So want to know more about, you know, why does it seem to or appear that the focus, the emotion that we're focused on is the anger emotion?
Can I jump in real quick on that? My immediate response to that is, you know, anger as an emotion, you know, is sometimes really about control. And so, I think sometimes the use of anger is an attempt to control, be it a narrative, an individual, resources of some sort. And I think that perhaps in an increasingly connected world, to use that popular phrase, it's somewhat perhaps perverse, but we might actually feel like we have less control. And I think, one way for us to try to have some semblance of control sometimes is through the use of anger. I don't disagree with Dr. Parrott's point on this. I think I'm just trying to come at it a little bit sideways, as I often do. And I think the last thing I would say is that sometimes, let's keep in mind anger is 100% appropriate, as well. And so I would definitely concur with the push for inspirational, surprising stories, especially their potential to be associated, let's say, right, with other aspects of the veteran experience. But I wouldn't want to do away with or demonize the use of anger by our journalists or by our veterans.
Dr. Parrott?
No, so that's a great point. There's actually a field of research in communication, in mass communication, that deals with political communication, and anger is one of the most powerful motivators for political action. And as Dr. Albright was saying there, it can be used for, it's not necessarily a bad thing unto itself, because it can be used for positive change. It can, pro-social change. But then it can also definitely be used for control. And so I think anger and misinformation can be coupled into a very influential package that can be very powerful. I'm trying to get back to the question here. You'd ask for specific recommendations, right? Still have the mic?
Can you hear me? Okay. Yes.
Yeah,
And even to what was just said, Dr. Albright, with the anger, I still look at that as if you're angry and then you want to do something about it, something good about it, I look at that as inspiration. That's more my definition of inspiration, not anger. So the anger part where you talked about, control, yes, that that made sense to me. But the anger versus I'm going to do something about this to make this better, to me, that's inspiration. I'm inspiring you to do something more. So I was asking about how we can focus more on the inspiration versus the control, or the anger that is possessing people to not be inspired.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's engagement with journalists, because I don't think journalists are actively. I think it's a cycle, honestly, and so I don't think journalists are trying to go out and cover stories that make people angry. But then one of the news values is conflict, and so when there's conflict in the community, journalists are going to cover it. And so, I guess the approach that I'm kind of advocating here is sort of balancing it and trying to focus more on inspirational and surprising stories. And really, I think if you connect journalists with those stories, just by developing relationships with journalists, or getting them, considering news values like timeliness, proximity. So if something positive involving veterans happens within a community and it recently happened, I bet a local journalist would cover it. In terms of the conflict, I don't think journalists are actually trying to generate anger, but what happens is you have community conflict, and then a journalist covers it, and then I think it's almost like throwing fuel on the fire, and so a cycle develops where there's more conflict, and then social media doesn't necessarily help with the comments that are angry and negative, and so it can spread quickly. And so I guess I'm saying that there is the potential there, based on research. that you can do the opposite, and you can inspire and do the same thing. Have stories that go viral, have stories that reach large populations, but they seize upon sort of those positive emotions of hope and inspiration. And so that's one avenue that I think you can pursue.
I just wanted to second that idea of really getting to local journalism. A lot of the larger news organizations really get a lot of their ideas and stories from local journalists. So they'll be looking, somebody's on Twitter, and the editor's on Twitter and sees a story and wants to build on it, and then you end up with a national platform for what could be a really sweet, wonderful, inspirational story. My favorite story I've ever written was actually about love. I mean, it was a tragedy, but it was sad and beautiful and inspirational. And I wouldn't have known it except for actually the veterans community. TAPS, that organization, put us in touch with. This was for the New York Times. Put us in touch with somebody who had a really great story to tell. So to some extent, the veteran service organizations, they have a unique ability to connect journalists with these great stories. And while journalists are really actually pretty busy and sometimes it's hard to break through, they have a great responsibility to get the stories told, and you all can do the same thing. Like whatever town you're in, you could call up whatever veterans reporter it is and say, hey, have a cup of coffee, and you probably know somebody that has a great story, or if you see something that's interesting, try to call it to the local media's attention, and you could just build on this platform.
I'd like to add one more thing there. One thing that we've noticed with our research too is that there's two different times when journalists tend to really focus on veterans, and it's Veterans Day and Memorial Day. And so you can imagine the kind of narratives that emerge from that. And so also ensuring that journalists pay attention to veterans year round, I think, is incredibly important. And I think this is one way to do it. And I was going to say that this might not be as practical for everyone, but we've also noticed that veterans and other groups can bypass traditional journalists nowadays because of social media. And so again, it's kind of flipping it on its head, where we've been picking apart social media, but social media can actually be used for positive change as well. And so I was just looking, and I don't know how everyone feels about this group, or if you know this group, but there's this Black Rifle Coffee Company. They do YouTube videos where they pick apart old war movies and basically make fun of them, like old John Wayne movies, for how they represent military service. And the reason I mention them is they have a following of 800,000 subscribers on YouTube, and their videos get millions of views. And so it offers sort of a challenge to sort of traditional media narratives, and it doesn't even use the traditional media. And so there's alternative ways to do it as well. And again, I don't know what people's opinions are of that group. You might love it, you might not. I don't know. But I'm just using it as an example that, there are alternative approaches out there.
I will add that company also has their own blog, which just actually one of their blog posts won an award at the Military Reporters and Editors Conference this year. So, there are platforms out there, citizen journalism. You all can just jump on and do it yourselves.
So I don't know if you all can see the clock, but we're running out of time. So thank you for coming, for participating. Thank you for the insight in the conversation. Any real quick, like 30-second closing thoughts? We'll start with you, Ms. Kime.
Just thanks for having me, and I look forward to actually getting to know more of you, because the more veterans I know, I value every single time I talk to a veteran or a military service member, because it makes my writing all the richer and more comprehensive.
Dr. Parrott.
I'd echo that. Thank you for having us and giving us a chance to talk about this subject. And then, David and I are virtual here, but we'd love to connect with anyone who wants to connect with us. And so feel free to reach out. We'd love to talk.
Yeah, that was my punchline too. Please, I think perhaps we often hear people up on the stage or, behind a podium say, hey, reach out to me. But some of you might have actually already done that with me. And what I would say is that I know I'm pretty responsive, and I suspect Scott is pretty responsive. So if you have interest here, do reach out, because I think you're going to find individuals who want to learn from you. So make that effort, connect.
Thank you. Appreciate it, y'all. Have a good night.
Okay, thank you very much. Just a couple of quick thank yous. First of all, thank you to all of our panelists who shared their information and expertise with us today. We really appreciate your time. Thank you to all of our lead proteges for cohort 5 who worked really hard to put together timely and interesting panels for you all. And as you can probably tell, this is no easy feat in a hybrid kind of post-COVID environment. So another round of applause for our lead proteges, those who are here in the room and those who are joining us remotely. And then of course, thank you so much to our hosts at DAV. They have been incredible to work with. Randy Reese, the executive director here, is always wonderful to HillVets, but I want to especially call out Amanda and Leroy at DAV in support services, who have helped us with everything from parking to room setup to sandwich refrigeration and everything in between. So we really appreciate all of our DAV friends and partners. You can still apply for cohort 6 of HillVets Lead, which will be kicking off in a little bit here this year. We try to do 2 cohorts a year. Those application materials and FAQs are available on our website at hillvet.org. You can also follow us on social media at HillVets across Facebook, Twitter, Instagram for updates on summer and fall events as we gather together again after many, many, many months of not doing so. We're very excited about that. And thank you to everybody who tuned in today and who came in person. We really appreciate you engaging with us. We hope you learned something. We hope you met someone new. We hope we sparked some ideas. And we just really appreciate all of your support. So thank you so much and have a wonderful evening.